All right, so let's just pause for a second and kind of look at what we have going on here in this project. So on the code, we have a bunch of lines, and we're going to go down line by line. So go ahead and scroll up to the top of the project. At the very top, we have a bunch of these lines that start with slash slash. See that 1 through 7 on mine? It might be more on yours. And they start with these slash slashes. And the slash slashes, that means it's a comment line. If a line starts with that slash slash, it can have anything after it. And basically what that means is the computer's just going to ignore that line. So the computer ignores it completely. It's just a comment. This gives you some information about, who made it. There's another comment you can see on line 15 that says, do any additional setup after loading the view. So a comment, again, like they don't affect the program in any way. They're notes to yourself. So it's how you can make little notes to yourself. And in fact, we're going to be using comments a lot, and we're going to add some right now. I have below that the line that says import UI kit. And import UI kit, you're going to sometimes have projects that say import at the top of them. They might have a bunch of these, like import foundation, import UI kit, import health kit, things like that. UI kit is essentially a framework that we're going to be working with throughout the semester, and basically it just means how we handle the user interface. UI stands for user interface. Within here, and pretty much all the code that we write is based on UI kit for now. So we're going to be writing a lot of code like UI label, UI text field, see all those different pieces, UI view controller. Those are all tied to the framework called UI kit. And then below that we have a class. It says class view controller, UI view controller, and then a curly brace. You'll notice whenever I click that curly brace, it highlights the one at the bottom of my code as well. And that's showing me the matching curly brace, like which curly brace matches which one. So what you'll notice here is our entire code, the code that we wrote, is encapsulated, right? It's contained within those curly braces of that class. A class, for now, which we'll get into classes in week 6, but for now, classes are basically like, that's your whole program. You can think of it as it contains your whole program in it. We're going to learn how to write custom classes and how to do all kinds of things later. All right, so going down from that, within that class, all your code's always going to go within your class. And if you have code outside of the class, it can cause issues. So we're going to be really careful and keep all of it within that class. So going a little further down, we have this section of code that says override func view_did_load, and then it's got a little curly brace and then some other lines within that curly brace. And I'm just going to highlight that whole little section. So the starting curly brace to the second curly brace. That is going to be in every program that you make by default. And what this is really simple. This is a function, and it's called the view_did_load function. And all it's doing is it's anything that you need to run right whenever it opens, you put it in there. So anything, whenever we get into functions next week, we'll go deeper into this. But basically, that's like a function that's just kind of setting up the view and making sure everything loads okay. So let's say we had something where, okay, when we open up the app, we want the background color to immediately change to a different color. That's where we would put it. Or we need to load some other piece of data. That's where we would put it. So that happens every time you open up the program. And then below that, we have the things that we connected. We have an IB outlet, right? It says at IB outlet var my label, which was the name we gave it, followed by UI label. So these lines, these two lines, let's add a comment above them. So I'm on line 18 on mine. It might be a different line on yours. And I'm going to just do //. So remember, that means ignore this computer. And I'm going to add a comment that says, here is where I connected my label and my text field as outlets. Okay? So an outlet basically is a way to connect something in the user interface, so like a label or a text field, to your code. And whenever we connect it as an outlet, what we're saying is we're going to use that thing in some way. We're going to either get data from it or send data to it. Okay, so it's an input or an output. So for example, which one of these is an input for us? The text field or the label?
Oh, the text field.
The text field, right? Because we're typing into that. So that's our input. And where are we outputting the data?
The label.
The label. So an outlet is kind of a two-way road. It's an input or it's an output. And we can use it for different things. Okay.
Can I swap these two so that it makes more sense to myself?
What do you mean by swap? Like
right now
cut them
I have the label above the text field Like, could I switch those two places?
You could. Now, sometimes whenever we copy and paste, I'm going to show you on my screen first. You'll notice outlets or anything that's IB, that's Interface Builder, stands for Interface Builder, by the way, and this is called the Interface Builder. Whenever they're connected to code, they have these little dots next to them, and those little dots are connected to the thing that you've, drawn the connection from. Sometimes, if you don't copy the entire line or cut the entire line, it can kind of freak out. So what you want to do is you want to swap these two spots. So I'm gonna command X here, which is cut, and you're gonna see that dot disappeared. And then I'm gonna go below this one and command V to paste, and that dot reappeared. So the dot reappeared. Everything's good, okay? And my errors went away. This time it worked. Sometimes whenever you do that, the connections get a little bit wonky and you're going to have to reconnect some things. And that's the number one error, in fact, that people encounter. And what that error will look like is it's called a SIGABERT error or a signal abort error, where basically it's going to try to do something and it won't be able to find it. And it's a little tricky to solve, but I'll show you how to solve that actually next week. So I have those things connected, okay, and then I have my action below that. So I'm going to add a few lines, and I'm going to write a comment above my action.
Can I put a comment on the same line as like a code line?
So you can't, because basically you can. There's kind of ways to do it like this,
Okay.
where I can add it at the end of the line. If I try and add it at the beginning of the line, it's going to comment out the line, and that's a phrase you're going to hear me say a lot: is comment out something, which means basically we're going to just hide a line from the computer's view. So you could, at the end of a line, I could write comment and say input, and then on this one I could do a little comment and say output if I wanted to. Good question. Let's do a different style of comment on this line. Instead of doing // so I'm going to write a little description of what an action is right here. Instead of doing // and writing something and then hitting return and // and writing something else to get multiple lines, like if you were doing like a paragraph or something, you might have to do this a bunch. It's a little tedious. A faster way to do this with comments is you can do /*, and then it'll add a little */, and hit return a couple times. And now anything contained between those two is going to be commented out. So I can write long paragraphs on multiple lines to add a comment if I really wanted to. All right, I'm going to delete that for now. I'm going to leave the little asterisks and stuff, and we're going to write what this action is. So the top two, you understand we connected those as outlets, and an outlet is an input or an output. This one, we connected as an action. So below here, I connected this as an action instead of an outlet. Okay. An action is the same thing as a function. I'm going to be using those terms interchangeably a lot. Okay? Function is the technical name for it. Action is what Interface Builder calls it. So just so that we're on the same page. So an action basically means it's something that happens when the user interacts with it. Okay, so this function occurs when the button is tapped, right? Something you'll notice is about the verbiage that I use, or verbiage that I use for each of these. So with the text field outlet, I called it my text field. I call this one my label. And I called this one, I didn't call this one my button, I called it button tapped. That's a sort of standardized process in many programming languages, is you use nouns to describe things like variables and outlets and stuff like that. And you use verbs, typically past tense verbs, to describe functions or actions. So with this is a button tapped, okay? That's going to be called, and we're going to get into this more in the future, but I'm going to call that calling the function, okay? Or calling the action. It's okay if we use either phrase there. So calling the function is when this is executed. So right now, this isn't executed until someone taps it. Once they tap that button, then the code's executed, okay? So it's called, and I'm going to be using that phrase a lot, so I just want you to be on the same page with the phrasing there. It's called whenever somebody taps it. We're going to learn next week how to call other functions, and we're going to do lots of cool things with user interface stuff. But yeah, so basically, this is the very simple setup of pretty much the rest of the projects for this class. You're connecting stuff, you're tying it to the code, and then you're taking in data, and then you're outputting data in some way, and you're listening for a user to interact in some way. This is pretty much it, okay? The last thing I want to talk about is the fix that we applied earlier to, on mine it's line 30, but if you remember, we applied a fix here with the myTextField.text exclamation point. I'm going to delete that exclamation point and let it give me that error that I had again. So you might have to wait a second for the compiler to catch up, and the error appears. And I want you to just understand this error for a second. So we're going to get into optionals much later in the class and talk about what they really mean. And I explained it really briefly in the last video, but what this is this is actually one of the unique things with Swift. And if you're coming into this from other programming languages, you usually don't have to worry about this stuff at all. Something like Java that kind of just ignores what are called nil values. So a nil, if you ever see that word, NIL, that might be a new term for you. A nil is something that has no value. It doesn't mean zero, because zero is technically a value. It means there's nothing there. It can't find anything. It's the absence of value. So in this case, what this is saying is the computer is worried that there's nothing in myTextField.text, meaning what if there's nothing typed in there? One of the great things about Swift and one of the most difficult things about Swift is that it is one of the safest languages, meaning it tries to keep you from crashing all the time. It tries really hard to keep you from breaking a program. So hard, in fact, that it will give you an error if it even thinks that there's a possibility that someone could break this, with having nothing in this text field. So it's saying, what happens if I find nil here? What happens if I hit the button, and I'm supposed to go grab this text, but there's no text there? What do I do? And it doesn't know what to do. We fixed it last time by just using this bottom fix, which says force unwrap using exclamation point. That is not the way that we want to do it. The exclamation point is sort of what we've told the computer is, you know what, even if there's nothing in there, just run it anyways. And what would happen if there was nothing in there, or if it found nil, it would just crash the program. And on your iPhone, that's what happens whenever you open up an app, you do something, you hit a button, and suddenly the app just closes. Like, it doesn't give you a warning, it doesn't give you an alert, it just like goes back to your home screen. Usually it's something like that. They've force unwrapped it. Instead, we're going to go with this second option, which says, again, of course it uses the very technical language, but it's understandable once you kind of slow down. Coalesce using question mark to provide a default when optional value contains nil. What this is saying is, hit the fix button. Let's hit it. This is the first fix button. It added question mark, and then it says default value. And if I click on that, I can just start typing and fill it in. And let's do quote, and we'll say blank. I'll just write the word blank. So it's still going to give us an error, and that's okay. But what this is saying is question mark, blank. So it's saying, if you don't find anything in the text, then instead output this. Now what's happening here, we're getting this error, and I'll explain why. And none of these fixes are going to work, by the way, that it's offering. Because this is in a sort of mathematical equation, this is just like in math class where you have to use parentheses to say what's going to happen first and what's going to happen second. We just need to put this whole thing in parentheses. So I'm putting a parentheses at the start of my text field and a parentheses around the end of blank. And you do want to actually write something in there. What you were seeing before where it was highlighted is a really cool thing where it's basically like a fill in the blank. And you'll see that with a bunch of stuff that we'll do later where it'll have little highlighted sections and you can fill in the blanks. So it's the default value that appeared whenever we did that question mark was just like a fill in the blank. So now this should work, and if it doesn't find any value, instead it'll use blank. You can see why this is much better. Yes, it's a little bit more complex than just using an exclamation point, but you can see why this would be better than using an exclamation point. Okay, so that pretty much wraps this up. The only other thing that I want to talk about is essentially where do we go from here with the label? The assignment this week is basically you're going to continue with this, and you're going to create an app where I'm going to type in my name, and it's going to say hello with my name, and then it's going to give me information about you. And it's really simple, but a couple of you may get tripped up by the label system and how label works. So with the label, right now by default it's one line. If I go ahead and open up my inspector pane on the right-hand side and go to my attributes editor, which is the one that kind of looks like a little belt buckle is what I always think. It's like a slider. We need to probably give it more lines. So there's a lines option of 1. So I'm going to give it like 3 lines, and then just make my label a little bit bigger, a little taller. And that should let me have a lot more text. I'm going to just try this out. We'll do text.
How'd you make it taller?
I just grabbed one of the little square
it.
handles. Yeah. We're going to see how this works with a bunch of things like this. I'm going to go ahead and run it. I just added another plus on the end, and then another thing in quotes. And it works. So it gives me a bunch of lines whenever I do that. Good? All right. So that's a thing that easily trips people up, is not using that lines. You have to tell it how many lines you want by default. And just, slow down and go through this alignment, or the alignment up above that too is where you can decide like how it justifies the text and stuff within those lines. So read through the assignment. Basically, you're just continuing with this app. I have a bunch of stretch goals for this assignment, which again, that's a system, and you can read more about it, but that's a system where you have a minimum viable product, which is to make basically what we just made. That will get you an 85 on the assignment. And then if you complete stretch goals, that adds points to your assignment if you want to really push and challenge yourself. So just explore. It's okay if things break. You may want to, save this, back up the folder, and, work with it later. But that is essentially our first week. So work on this, do the reading, make sure Xcode's, working for you. And if you have any questions, reach out to your instructor or post in the discussion board, and we'll chat about it.